Do you also have a great looking project but your render times are killing you? Well, today I will be sharing you my tips I learned over the years working as a VFX artist. This is applicable to any DCC, but I'll be working with Arnold, but most of these things are transferable to other render engines like RenderMan or V-Ray, so be sure to check out today's video where I'll be giving away most of my tips which I do to get better, faster, and even prettier renders. Alright, so now that everyone is ready and excited to get started, I first of all want to thank the sponsor of today's video, which is Autodesk, a huge software company which is responsible for 3ds Max, AutoCAD, lots of other DCCs, and obviously Maya, which I'll be using today to show you how to get better interaction in your render scenes, how to get better denoising, how to get cleaner scenes. And yeah, I will be sharing you all my experience or all the tips I gathered during the time. So I think enough said, let's get going and see how you can optimize your scenes. Alright, the first concept I want to get out of the door is, which most people get wrong actually, is that if you have, for the same amount of samples, your render produces less noise. It means your render is actually faster. So whenever there's an Arnold update and it says, oh, we reduced the noise in area lights, for instance, it just means that for the same amount of samples you had before, it will produce less noise, which means that the render time will get smaller, faster. So just keep that concept in mind. I'll be going through this and using this idea of faster renders throughout this video. I just wanted to get that out there first, that less noise in a render means the render is faster. Alright, this one might seem as an obvious one, but I see lots of people on my videos and on my channel is they are using outdated Arnold versions and ask me, why don't I have this feature, why don't I have this and that? So a very important one. Alright, so just go to your Arnold tab in the menu up there, go to About and see what Arnold version you have. And then let's say download Arnold render, and let's say we are feeling lucky. And then you should get directly to the download page, and down here you can download the version you have for your Maya version, so 18 or for Houdini, and this is the latest builds which are uploaded. So make sure to download and install it and compare it to the version up here in the menu, and then you are on the latest version and you should have all the updates and the best render engine. One of the most common questions I'm getting on my channel is, why are my renders so slow? And most of the time it's due to oversampling. So I'll be showing you guys how to not oversample your shots, how to get the most optimal render settings. And yeah, be sure to check out this in-depth tip now, how you can optimize your scenes. Okay, so don't oversample. So first of all, I go to presets and I'll be just using the default settings. So this is how your settings will be. I just want to change my resolution quick. And so as I said, these are the default settings, and I already think that they are, at least for the basic setting, a bit too much. Like it's not very optimized. What I see quite often is render settings which are way oversampled. So just to get clean renders on this, you can see there's quite a lot of noise in here, and even on the diffuse side here. I see lots of time that values are just pushed up like this, and this is completely oversampling your renders. Obviously they will be clean, but your renders will take a lot longer to complete. You can see it's still running those buckets. So you can see the render is still going and it's still not even resolved yet. So what I always do when I want to get clean renders, I just disable everything to 0, and I also make sure my ray depth is at 1 and not higher than 1. And then I'll probably start at 3 or 4 AA samples, and if I see still noise, I'm just increasing the samples. So let's say if I boost my diffuse samples, you can see that the noise is not really getting better, and the reason for that is that the noise is not coming from the diffuse or the specular samples. It's not even coming from the AA samples. This noise here, which you can see, is coming from the lights itself. So in the light settings, I'm not sure if this is the right one, but you would need to boost up the light samples. Maybe let's try to pick the right one. And you can see now by just doing that from 1 sample to 2 or 3, this gets completely clean already, and there's no need at all to go crazy on your AA samples. So I think even on 2, this will be clean already. So just keep in mind that you do not oversample and you figure out where the noise is coming from. And the best way to do it is just by killing diffuse indirect and specular indirect samples first and see if you can get a clean render. And if you can, your render times will go very, very fast. By disabling them though, you will not get any indirect bounces. So if you want to get bounce light, you obviously would need to have them. But sometimes it is not really necessary. So you can get rid of those if you don't need it visually. And you can compare the render times. They are way different and a lot faster if you optimize those settings. Following up with the previous tip, I see lots of people using too many ray bounces. So a good tip here is do not overdo your ray bounces, because your render time will get really slow if you have more than bounces as necessary. And I will show you exactly how you can dial it in so it is just working perfectly for your needs. Talking about the ray depth, it's very important that you do not use too many bounces here. Obviously you want to get the realism, but do not overdo it. At some point, especially for interior scenes, most of the time 4 bounces for diffuse is enough. So just compare your bounce, your resulting render with 4 depth and then maybe 6, and just see visually if there's a big difference. And if there's no difference, just go to the lower ray depth value. This will save you tremendously amount of render time, and the same applies for specular ray bounces. Typically, I never go over 2 for specular unless you do have like lots of glass panes, lots of metallic objects reflecting with each other. Then you might need to bump it up, but just keep in mind to not overdo it. This will save you a lot of render time. Alright, now you have good render settings and everything looks fine, but you still don't know why your render times are so high. So lots of people I see also use a very high amount of light samples, which are not part of the global render settings. Each specific light has its own light sample section on the shape of each node. So a good tip is to not overdo it. Most of the time, 2 samples are more than enough for any render settings you have in your scene. So do not overdo it. I will show you exactly what I mean by that. I briefly talked about the light samples, and it's very important to not overdo this because they are linked directly to your render settings AA samples. So what I always recommend is do not go over 2, maybe 3. Between 2 and 3 I say is a good value because they are tied to your AA samples. For low render settings, it's good to go a bit higher on the light samples, maybe 3 to 4. But once you go into medium to high render settings, where you will set your AA samples to probably between 6 and 10, you should be reducing your AA samples to, your light samples to 2, just because they are multiplied with each other, and it will just oversample your lights if you do not pay attention to your light samples. Another good one is that make sure that your resolution for your environment lights are not exceeding 4K. Most of the time, even 1K is more than enough to get the lighting information out of the environment maps. I know HR Haven and other sites, they offer 16K maps, but honestly that is just ridiculous for most of the lighting needs. If you have a very reflective environment, yes, you might go up maybe to 8K, but it's not really necessary. And I will show you a comparison in render time from 1K to 16K, and I will show you the visual difference between that. So make sure to check out this one. Alright, so now let's see how this works in action. So I have my 1K light connected, so let's just update the full scene and render and see how fast it takes to render. It's pretty much instantaneous, and I do not have the TX files baked to disk. They are only created at render times. Alright, now let's switch it up and go to the 16K map. So this is not connected, and I'll just do the same thing. And you can already see now by just connecting it up, it takes a long time to update the viewport, but you can see the quality will be better in the viewport. You can see now we have a better representation of the map in the viewport. And now let's just go to render update full scene. And as I said, these maps are not on disk. Alright, you can see it visually, there is no big difference. Only obviously you see the background is changing because it is a higher resolution map. But the asset, which is lit by this light source, there is no visual difference, and you can actually get away with a 1K map quite easily, which will save you lots of resources, and obviously time to first pixel will be a lot better. Especially when you're working with different departments or just different kind of data streams like effects, VDBs, lots of texture from look dev, light textures, and all these different assets in your scene which take up lots of space. it's very important to have all your project files which you are using on your fastest drive, because at render time all this data is being sucked into the in the render engine, and it needs to be fast, otherwise you will get a bottleneck in read and write time. So make sure that all your project files are on the same, and especially on the fastest drive you have. You have a fairly optimized scene, but you still cannot get rid of the noise. And one important thing is to know that mesh lights and emissive textures are very prone to produce lots of noise. So my tip, and what I use all the time, I try to always use area lights because they are the most optimized ones for Arnold. And you have rec lights, area lights, and you do have cylindrical lights as well. And try to use them as much as you can to get cleaner renders. Alright, I have the mesh light above the little asset here, so let's render this. And now I'm using an area light which is set to cylindrical lighting. And this shape, you can change it to cylinder, and then you get a cylindrical light. And you can see the difference is amazing. Mesh light versus area light. It's a huge time saver, and this is what I was talking about. It means less noise, which means a faster render. So you do not need to crank up your samples to get a clean render for the same identical light. So make sure to only use mesh lights if it's really necessary. While working interactively in your scene, sometimes it's very hard to navigate because it's rendering and you're still changing parameters and everything is sluggish and yeah, it's not so fluid as it should be. So a good tip I can recommend is go to your render settings and make sure that you are saving threads for the UI, and you do that by changing the value to a negative number, which means it will save threads from rendering. So make sure to have that on to get a very nice, smooth and interactive session. Alright, you have two options to optimize your scene interactivity while you are testing shading or setting up lights. So one is to go to your render tab here and save your iThreads, and you can pick 1, 2 or 3 threads of your CPU to be saved for Windows for the UI. So you can pick it, let's say 3. Let's see how this works. You can see if I move now, let's see, update this. If I move it, it's still a bit sluggish here. You can see it's not perfectly smooth, and even if I move shader values, it is not 100% nice. Compare this to off. You can see it's a lot worse if it's off. You can see how it's really struggling to keep up with my viewport. Depending on your CPU, depends how many threads you can spare. So obviously keep that in mind. That's what I always do. I set this value to none, and you can go into your render settings under system, and where it says auto detect threads, what you can do is uncheck that, and then you can pick how many threads should be used for rendering. And I have a very high-end machine here which has 80 threads. It's 2 physical CPUs, that's why I have so many threads. So what I always like to do, I like to type in a negative value, -20, and that means I'm sparing 20 threads for the UI, which gives me the most interactive session. So let's say if I update the render from scratch and start, you can now see how fluid everything is. And I can move lights, I can move the asset, everything is a very fluid, and it's really fun to work like that. You can see if I move it, it's like a real-time render engine essentially. If I move lights, it's the same way. So that is a very huge tip I can recommend, is to make sure that you optimize your threads so you have a fair amount of threads saved for interactive renders and a fair amount of saved threads for your UI. This is not applicable for offline rendering, so whenever you kick off the render as a batch render, it will still use all the resources. Okay, here we come with another huge tip, which is the TX Manager. On default, when you load Maya or you load Arnold, it is set up to automatically create TX files for your needs. But if you ever want to render a sequence, or you want to make sure you have, like if you have large files on disk and you want to start the render immediately, make sure to use the TX Manager to pre-bake your TX files for the renderer. So the time to first pixel will be instant instead of waiting for the TX file to generate on render time. Alright, right now I have no TX files written out to disk. We can also make sure just to flush all my textures. So let's go to flush and just flush everything. And another important thing is in your render settings under textures, disable auto convert textures to TX files, and it should use existing TX files on disk if it finds them. So what I do and what I would recommend you do is go into the TX manager and make sure you create the TX files in here before you start your renders. So you can just say either select all or select untiled and then just create TX for selected. It will take some time to process all the maps, but once that is done, your render time or your time to first pixel will be a lot faster, which will improve your render times, especially if you do batch renders on different threads or different machines. The textures are on disk and it will just start rendering immediately. Alright, so the TX files are created. I flushed all the caches, so let's just update full scene. And you can see it's instantaneous when the render starts. Everything is on disk, everything gets loaded in instantaneously, and you just get a quick render to start with. Something which I should actually use more often as well is stand-ins. They are a very optimized proxy bucket for your render engine, which means that you can have a very high dense and high detailed mesh. You export that and load it back in as a stand-in, and then the memory footprint is very low. You can instance this object across your scene and the memory footprint will not change. It will reuse all the baked textures and everything, which just makes your scene blazingly fast. Your scene file size on disk goes down because it's exported. It's like a reference. So make sure to use stand-ins way more than you're using right now. They're highly efficient and it's just a treat to work with. Alright, let me first show you how to create a stand-in. So whatever object you have selected, you can just go to the Arnold menu, export this to an AS file, which means export selection or export the whole scene, but typically you just want to export the selected object. You can also export Alembic, it does not matter, or USD, so either or of these work fine for your stand-in. So just export the object as one of those and you should be good to go. So I already exported the heavy loader asset, so in the Arnold menu I can just go to stand in and create that, which will creates me an empty stand-in object, which I can select a path to. And then I'm just selecting the exported file, load that up, and you can see we get this bounding box. And this is the most efficient way to display an object. So you have different visualization options here. You can pick bounding box, polywire. You can pick also point cloud, which I use quite often. And you can see it's an instance of that object. So if I render this now, you should see there is the second one appearing now. And you can see how nice and fast and interactive this guy moves. And I can just go, for instance, view from perspective here. And I can just move it right next to him. I can Shift D it, copy it over, and then we can hit Shift D a few more times. And you can see they are just getting instanced. Maybe let's create our dome light so we can see them. And there you are. We have all those little assets standing right next to each other. And we can really go crazy by duplicating them because they are living or reading from the same file on disk. The memory footprint is exactly the same. And you can see I can just duplicate them at render times, and this is really amazing for lots of objects, and especially if you have huge scenes with lots of assets. This is a huge time saver, and also it's very light on your scene. If you save the scene now, the disk of the file on disk will be very low, but you have all this nice data in your scene. It's always nice to render motion blur and even depth of field in the render because it just looks more pretty and it's accurate, right? But it's a huge render time increase if you want to render motion blur and depth of field, or just motion blur or just depth of field. You need to crank up your AA samples by quite a lot to get a clean render. So my tip is, do you really need depth of field or do you really need motion blur in your renders? Because there's workarounds to render motion vector passes, which you can then apply in compositing to get a 2D motion blur. It's not always the best. I'm not saying you should not do 3D motion blur, but it is still something to consider if you have a need for fast renders. And the same for depth of field. You do not need to bake it in. You can render a Z pass, or you can render your shot in deep and then use a ZD focus in your compositing software. So it's just something to consider if you can do that in compositing later on, or if you actually really need to bake in that extra amount of render time essentially. So understand that and use your best judgment to decide if you want to use motion blur or depth of field or both in combination. Alright, I have depth of field enabled now, and you can see already that in the bokeh we get lots of noise, and even in the out of focus regions here it's super noisy, and the only way to clean it up is by bumping up your AA samples. So let's see if I just create a region around this bokeh object here, and I just boost my AA samples, let's say to 14. You should see that they are getting a lot cleaner, but it's still, the render time goes up by quite a lot. So it's very important that if you render depth of field or motion blur, you need to crank up your AA samples. And for motion blur alone, it's maybe alright to go around 12. But for really strong depth of field, you might go to 20 AA samples. But then it's very important to not oversample your shot. So make sure your diffuse and spec and even SSS samples are very low. Probably recommended is keep them at 1. And the same for your light samples. So that's very important if you have high AA samples to reduce your light samples as well. So that's why this tip is about making sure you do not oversample when you use motion blur or depth of field. And if you want to use them, obviously you will get a render time hit. So think about it twice if you can actually render this as a separate pass for comp to do it later on. And to do that, you would go to your AOVs, and for depth of field, you would essentially just output that Z pass, which is a distance to camera per object essentially. And for motion blur, all you have to do is apply or create that motion vector pass. And in your render settings under motion blur, all you have to do whenever you have motion blur on, make sure you just enable instantaneous shutter, which essentially visually disables motion blur, but it will write out the motion vector into that AOV. That way, in compositing, you can blur your image based on this motion vector. So these two AOVs are needed for depth of field and for the 2D motion blur in compositing. Here comes another huge one. It is one of the biggest time savers for render time, and it is Arnold's built-in noise denoiser. You can use that after render, so you just need to make sure that you output certain variants AOVs, which help the denoiser to give you cleaner renders. And what it means is that you can render a more noisy image, which is faster, but then you can run it through the denoiser, which will give you a clean result. So that is a huge time saver. Make sure to denoise your renders to get cleaner and faster results. Alright, so this render now took me 6 seconds to render with very low settings, but it's still noisy. So let's try to clean up this render using higher samples. So let's just check the reflection here. So this is probably the specular. So if you boost that up, we should see it already got cleaner by just increasing the specular indirect passes. The rest is pretty clean. We still have a bit of noise in the shadow, so maybe go up to 5 AA samples, which should get rid of the noise right here. And let's see about this, if that is also cleaner. It's still a bit noisy, so let's go maybe up to 4 indirect spec samples. And this is now pretty clean. So now I feel comfortable to render this out. Alright, so this render took now 1 minute and 24 seconds with those render settings. So we can compare, this is our really 6-second render, really fast, and this is our high sample render. Let's save that to disk, and we want to make sure that we output diffuse albedo. Let's just stop the render. Let's see, we want to output normal and diffuse albedo like that. And then in the in the AOVs, then you go to denoiser and you output denoising AOVs. And you also want to add the Z pass to this as well. So these three AOVs plus that output denoising AOVs needs to be enabled for noise denoiser. In the Arnold tab, it's also, in the comment tab, it's also important to merge those AOVs together. So I'll be running this now on a batch render with our low settings, and then we will be denoising this. Alright, you can see we do have the render on disk, and we also have the AOVs, we have the and the noise normal, the diffuse albedo, and the variance, which is essentially the noise. And now let's actually denoise it. So what we gotta do, go to the Arnold menu up here, go to Utilities, and Arnold Denoiser Noise. Open that up, and then pick the input. So the input is actually our image we just rendered, so training 01, and it automatically appends the denoise path. And you can pick temporal stability if you have more than one frame, which will just check different frames to get a better stability. And then the defaults are quite good. Just hit denoise and they will be created on disk for you. And then you get a new file, which is the same one with a denoised suffix. And then you can just drag it in here and just visualize, compare them. And this is now the denoised version versus the non-denoised version, right? So this is actually a huge improvement. Obviously, it's not the same, not one-to-one the same. Let's actually save this one to disk 2 and just compare this as well. All right, so now we do have our non-denoised 6-second render, which looks like this. And this is the same 6-second render with the denoise applied. And then we do have our high setting render, which took 1 minute and 24 seconds, which is insanely much longer than the 6-second render. So it's 6 seconds versus 84 seconds. So it's a lot faster. So keep that in mind to use your denoise. You can see obviously it's not one-to-one the same. You still get a bit too much blurring in here, but it's still very good compared to those render times. So make sure to always consider denoising your renders for faster initial render times. So it's fine to render images out with noise like this, and then just run that through the denoiser to get a clean result. So that's a very important tip I can share, and we do this all the time at work and on personal projects as well. The tips I shared today with you are tips I use every day at work and also at personal projects. So make sure to use those ideas or recommendations in your own projects and let me know in the comments below how they work for you. Does that actually help? Do your render times get lower or even faster? Let me know how it goes, and I would also highly appreciate any feedback on these kind of videos. If you would like to see more of those, leave me a thumbs up so I know what's going on. So thanks again for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one.